Shadows of War. Chapter 1. The Return. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of the small rural cemetery, his hand resting on the cold, weathered stone of a tombstone. The wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth, a smell that always reminded him of the battlefield. He hadn't been back in this town since the day he left for war. The town hadn't changed much, but Ethan had. The horrors of battle had marked him in ways that went beyond the physical scars hidden beneath his sleeves. As he looked down at the name etched in stone, his heart tightened. Marcus Turner? His childhood friend, his brother in arms. They had fought side by side, but only Ethan had returned. He remembered the last time he saw Marcus, a smile on his face, a promise on his lips. "We'll make it out of this, Ethan." But Marcus didn't. The guilt of that broken promise had gnawed at Ethan for years. The funeral had been small, attended by few. The town had forgotten Marcus just as they had forgotten the war. But Ethan could never forget. It haunted his dreams, the sounds of gunfire, the cries of his comrades, the suffocating silence that followed. As Ethan turned to leave, a figure appeared at the cemetery's entrance. The man was tall, with a military bearing that was unmistakable. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, but Ethan could feel the weight of his gaze. "Ethan Cole," the man said, his voice firm but not unkind. Ethan stopped, his hand instinctively moving to where his weapon would have been. "Who's asking?" The man approached slowly, pulling out a badge and holding it out for Ethan to see. "Captain James Crow, Department of Defense." Ethan eyed the badge warily, then met Crow's gaze. "I'm done with that life." Crow nodded, pocketing the badge. So was Marcus, but some wars never really end. The mention of Marcus sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He narrowed his eyes. "What do you know about Marcus?" Crow hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "Marcus didn't die on the battlefield, Cole. Not the way you think." Ethan's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" Crow stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We need your help, Cole. There are things, shadows of that war, that still linger. And they've resurfaced." Ethan's mind raced. He had buried the war deep within him, locked it away, but now the past was clawing its way back. "Why me?" "Because you're the only one who can finish what was started," Crow said, his tone final, leaving no room for argument. "Meet me at the old warehouse by the docks tonight. All your questions will be answered there." Ethan stood there for a long moment after Crow left, his mind in turmoil. He had vowed never to return to that life, to the darkness of war. But now, with the mention of Marcus and the war that never ended, he felt a pull he couldn't resist. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan knew that whatever awaited him at the docks was not something he could walk away from. Not this time. He sighed, glancing one last time at Marcus's grave before turning away, his decision made. The shadows of war were closing in, and Ethan Cole was about to step into them once more. Chapter 2. The Meeting. The old warehouse by the docks was a relic of another era, its corrugated metal walls rusted and weather-beaten. Ethan Cole's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached, the darkness of the night wrapping around him like a cloak. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and the faint stench of decaying fish, a scent he had grown accustomed to in his time spent near the sea. The place was deserted, except for a single light glowing from within the warehouse. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to forget this whole mess. But something deep inside him, perhaps the same part that had driven him into war in the first place, pushed him forward. He reached the large, sliding door and hesitated for just a moment before gripping the cold metal handle and pulling it open. The door groaned in protest, revealing a cavernous space lit by a single hanging bulb. In the center of the room, a makeshift table had been set up, and around it sat 3 men, all of whom turned their heads as Ethan entered. "Welcome, Mr. Cole," said Crow, rising from his seat and gesturing to an empty chair. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Ethan walked over, his eyes scanning the room, taking note of every exit, every potential threat. "Let's get one thing straight," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm here for answers. If I don't like what I hear, I'm out." Crow nodded, seemingly unfazed. "Fair enough. But I think you'll want to stay once you hear what we have to say." Ethan took the seat, his muscles coiled with tension, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. The other two men remained silent, their eyes focused on Crow. Crow leaned forward, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "What do you know about Operation Black Dawn?" The name sent a jolt through Ethan's system. It was a name he hadn't heard in years, a Black Ops mission so classified that only a handful of men knew of its existence. Ethan had been one of those men. "It was supposed to be a cleanup mission," Ethan said slowly, his mind sifting through memories he had tried to bury. "We were sent in to neutralize a rogue faction operating in enemy territory. But things went south. Fast." Crow nodded, his expression grim. "What you don't know is that the mission wasn't just a cleanup. It was a cover-up." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Cover-up? Of what? Crow glanced at the two men beside him, then back at Ethan. "The enemy faction we were sent to eliminate, they weren't just rogue soldiers. They were involved in something much darker. Something that our government wanted buried." Ethan felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. "What kind of something?" Crow sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Experiments, Cole. On soldiers. On civilians. They were trying to create the perfect weapon. A soldier who could fight without fear, without pain, without mercy." Ethan's stomach turned. He had seen many horrors during the war, but the thought of men being turned into monsters by their own side was almost too much to bear. "And Marcus?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Crow's expression softened. "Marcus found out what was really happening. He tried to stop it. That's why he didn't make it back, Cole. They killed him to keep him quiet." Ethan felt a rage building inside him, a fire he had thought long extinguished. "And now?" Crow met his gaze, his voice deadly serious. "Now it's happening again. The experiments, the cover-ups. We need to stop it before it's too late. That's why we need you, Cole. You know how they operate and you have a personal stake in this. Will you help us?" Ethan sat back, his mind racing. He had wanted nothing more than to leave the war behind, to forget the blood and the pain. But now, knowing that Marcus had been killed to keep a secret, knowing that the horrors of Operation Black Dawn were still being carried out, he couldn't walk away. Not now. He looked at Crow, his decision made. "I'm in." Crow nodded, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "Good. We move at dawn." As Ethan left the warehouse that night, the shadows seemed darker, the air heavier with the weight of what was to come. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. And Ethan Cole was about to dive headfirst into its darkest depths. Chapter 3. The operation begins. The sky was just beginning to lighten when Ethan arrived at the designated rendezvous point, a nondescript black van parked in the shadows of an abandoned building. The air was crisp with the early morning chill, and the quiet was punctuated only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the docks. Ethan had barely slept the night before, his mind replaying the events of the previous evening, the revelations that had shaken him to his core. He approached the van, noticing the slight movement of the curtains in the window. Someone inside was watching, waiting for him. He rapped his knuckles against the side panel twice, a signal, and the door slid open silently. Crow was seated in the back, along with the two men from the warehouse, who Ethan had since learned were former Special Forces operatives. Men like himself who had been pulled back into the fray for one final mission. "Ethan," Crow greeted him with a nod, "glad you could make it. We're almost ready to move." Ethan stepped inside, the van's interior dimly lit by a red glow from the dashboard. He took a seat across from Crow, feeling the tension in the air, the shared anticipation of what was to come. "We've got a location on one of the labs," Crow continued, handing Ethan a tablet displaying satellite imagery. "It's an old facility hidden deep within the forest about 50 miles from here. According to our intel, they've been using it to continue their experiments. If we're lucky, we might be able to get in and out before they realize what's happening." Ethan studied the images, noting the layout of the facility, the surrounding terrain. It was remote, isolated, perfect for the kind of secretive work Crow had described. But that also meant it would be heavily guarded, with security measures designed to keep out anyone who wasn't supposed to be there. "What's the plan?" Ethan asked, his mind already beginning to map out the possibilities, the potential dangers. "We go in under cover of darkness," Crow said, his tone all business now. Take out the guards, disable the security, and retrieve any data we can find. We're looking for evidence, proof of what they've been doing. And if possible, we shut the operation down for good. Ethan nodded, the familiar rush of adrenaline starting to build in his veins. It was a dangerous mission, no doubt about it, but it was also one he was uniquely qualified to undertake. He had done this sort of thing before in the darkest corners of the world, where the line between right and wrong blurred until it almost didn't exist. Any idea what we're up against inside? Ethan asked, his eyes flicking back to Crow. Crow exchanged a glance with the other men before answering. We know they've been working on enhancing soldiers, physically, mentally. We don't know exactly what that looks like, but we have to assume these won't be ordinary men we're dealing with. Expect the worst and be prepared for anything. Ethan grimaced. It was one thing to go up against enemy soldiers, another to face men who had been turned into something more, something unnatural. We'll take 2 vehicles, Crow continued, outlining the specifics of the approach. Once we're inside, we split up. You and I will head for the main control room to secure the data. The others will handle the labs and any personnel they find. We regroup here, he pointed to a clearing near the facility's perimeter, and exfiltrate via helicopter. Timing is everything. We'll have less than 20 minutes from the moment we breach the facility. Ethan absorbed the details, his mind already running through the plan, identifying potential risks and how to mitigate them. It was a solid plan, but like all plans, it would be subject to the chaos of the moment. He knew that better than anyone. Let's do this, Ethan said, his voice calm but resolute. Crow gave him a grim smile. Good. We move out in 5. As the van pulled away from the city, the weight of the mission settled over the team. There was no turning back now. Whatever awaited them in that facility, Ethan knew it was tied to the war he thought he had left behind. And for Marcus, for the ghosts of the past, he would see this through to the end. The drive was long, the road winding through dense forests that grew darker as the sun disappeared behind thick clouds. Inside the van, the team remained silent, each man lost in his thoughts, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. When they finally reached the outskirts of the facility, the van slowed to a crawl, the headlights switched off. Crow motioned for everyone to gear up, and Ethan quickly checked his weapons, ensuring everything was in place. His heart beat steadily, his focus sharp. This was what he was trained for, what he was born for. The shadows of war had come for him once again, and he was ready to face them. As they exited the van and moved through the trees, the facility loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Ethan's senses heightened, every sound, every movement around him magnified. The time for hesitation was over. Ethan Cole was about to step into the heart of the storm. Chapter 4. The Storm Unleashed. The facility was eerily silent as Ethan and Crow approached the outer perimeter. The forest around them was still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the violence that was about to unfold. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, the way it coiled around them like a serpent ready to strike. Crow signaled to the other team members, who split off to cover different angles of approach. Ethan followed Crow as they crept toward the main entrance, their movements swift and precise. Every footstep was measured, every breath controlled. The darkness was their ally, concealing them as they closed in on the first obstacle, a tall chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Ethan knelt beside the fence, pulling out a pair of wire cutters. In a matter of seconds, he had created an opening just large enough for them to slip through. Once inside the perimeter, they pressed themselves against the wall of the facility, moving in sync toward the entrance. Crow held up a hand, signaling a stop. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small device, a jammer designed to disable the facility's external security systems. After a moment, the device emitted a soft click and Crow nodded to Ethan. "Security's down," Crow whispered. "We've got a few minutes before they notice." Ethan acknowledged with a curt nod, then took point as they approached the door. It was reinforced steel, but Ethan had dealt with similar doors before. He produced a small charge from his vest, attaching it to the door's locking mechanism. After a few seconds, there was a muffled pop, and the door swung open with a creak. They slipped inside, the interior of the facility dimly lit by emergency lights that cast long, ominous shadows across the walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of machinery in the distance. Ethan's senses were on high alert, every nerve in his body ready to react to the slightest sign of danger. They moved swiftly down the corridor, each turn bringing them closer to their objective. As they passed one of the laboratories, Ethan glanced through the small window in the door. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. Inside, there were rows of containment units, each one holding what appeared to be a human figure. But these were not ordinary men. Their bodies were grotesquely altered, muscles bulging unnaturally beneath their skin, their eyes vacant and lifeless. They were more machine than man, wired into the facility's systems by thick cables that pulsed with a sickly green light. Crow saw Ethan's reaction and glanced inside. His expression hardened. "This is worse than we thought," he muttered. Ethan forced himself to look away, pushing down the rising bile in his throat. "We need to get to the control room," he said, his voice tight. They continued on, passing more laboratories, each one filled with horrors that seemed to grow more grotesque the deeper they went. Ethan's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. These were not just experiments, they were abominations, creations of a twisted mind with no regard for human life. Finally, they reached the door to the control room. Crow motioned for Ethan to take up position on the opposite side. Ethan did so, his hands steady as he readied his weapon. Crow counted down silently, then kicked the door open. Inside, the control room was a hive of activity. Technicians in lab coats scrambled to react, but Ethan and Crow moved with deadly precision. Shots rang out, the technicians dropping before they had a chance to sound the alarm. Within seconds, the room was secure. Crow moved to the central console, pulling out a flash drive. "Cover me," he ordered as he began downloading the facility's data. Ethan took up position by the door, his eyes scanning the hallway. The facility was still eerily quiet, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The bodies of the technicians lay sprawled across the floor, their blood pooling beneath them, but there was no time to think about that now. "How long?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "Almost there," Crow replied, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Ethan's gut told him something was wrong. The mission was going too smoothly, the facility too quiet. Chapter 5. The Awakening. Ethan's gut told him something was wrong. The mission was going too smoothly, the facility too quiet. He turned his head, scanning the control room one more time, and that's when he noticed it, a small red light blinking in the corner of the room, partially obscured by one of the fallen technicians. It was a silent alarm, and it had been triggered. "Crow, we've got company," Ethan hissed, his pulse quickening. Crow looked up, eyes narrowing as he saw the light. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling the flash drive from the console. "We're out of time. We've got to move now." Ethan nodded, already moving toward the door. They had to get out before whatever was coming arrived. The mission had shifted from gathering intel to pure survival. As they burst into the hallway, Ethan's senses were on high alert. The facility was no longer silent. He could hear distant footsteps, the clatter of boots against metal flooring, growing louder with each passing second. The facility was coming alive, like a beast stirred from its slumber, and they were deep inside its belly. Crow was right behind him, his eyes sharp, scanning for threats as they made their way back the way they came. The corridors seemed longer now, the shadows deeper, as if the facility itself was conspiring to trap them. They rounded a corner and came face to face with a group of guards, their eyes wide with surprise. But Ethan and Crow didn't hesitate. The guards fell quickly, their bodies hitting the floor with dull thuds. "No time to clear them all," Crow said between breaths. "We need to get to the rendezvous point." Ethan nodded, his mind calculating their chances. They had less than 10 minutes to reach the extraction point before the entire facility would be swarming with reinforcements. They broke into a sprint, their boots echoing through the corridors as they raced against time. But as they neared the entrance, the lights in the facility flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. He could feel the facility's energy shifting, a low, menacing hum filling the air, vibrating through the walls and floor. And then he heard it, the sound that sent a chill down his spine. It was a low, guttural growl, like the rumbling of some terrible beast. The sound was coming from deep within the facility, but it was growing louder, closer. "Crow," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the humming. "We've got a problem." Crow's face was set in a grim line. "We need to keep moving." But Ethan knew they were no longer alone in the facility. Whatever was coming, it wasn't human. The growling grew louder, closer, reverberating through the darkened hallways. The shadows seemed to twist and stretch, as if the walls themselves were alive, closing in on them. And then they saw it, a figure emerging from the darkness, its form hulking and misshapen. It was one of the soldiers from the labs, but it was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Its skin was pale and slick, its muscles grotesquely exaggerated, pulsing unnaturally beneath its flesh. Wires and tubes ran from its body into the floor, connecting it to the very heart of the facility. Its eyes, once human, were now glowing with an unnatural, eerie light. Ethan's instincts kicked in, his weapon already trained on the creature, but something in the back of his mind screamed that bullets wouldn't be enough. "Get down," Crow shouted, firing at the creature. The bullets struck it, but the creature barely flinched, its monstrous form absorbing the impact. It let out a roar, a sound that shook the very walls around them. Ethan threw himself to the floor, narrowly avoiding a massive arm as it swung toward him. The creature moved with terrifying speed for something so large, its movements fluid and precise. It wasn't just a brute, it was a weapon designed to kill. "We need to get to the exit," Ethan yelled, scrambling to his feet as the creature turned its attention to Crow. Crow backed away, his eyes never leaving the monster. "I'll draw its attention. You get out of here." "No," Ethan shouted back, refusing to leave Crow behind. "We do this together." Crow fired another round, aiming for the creature's head. This time, the bullet seemed to have an effect, causing the creature to stumble. But it wasn't enough to stop it. The monster roared again, charging toward Crow with terrifying speed. Ethan acted on instinct. He grabbed a nearby metal pipe, swinging it with all his strength at the wires trailing from the creature's back. The pipe connected with a satisfying crunch, severing the cables that connected the creature to the facility. The effect was immediate. The creature convulsed, its movements becoming erratic as if it was struggling to maintain control of its own body. It swung wildly, missing Crow by inches, before collapsing to the ground in a twitching heap. Crow didn't waste a second. He grabbed Ethan by the arm, pulling him toward the exit. "We've got to go now." Together, they ran, the sounds of the facility's alarm blaring in their ears as they made their escape. The monstrous creature lay behind them, but Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before others would follow. They burst through the entrance, the cold night air hitting them like a slap to the face. The clearing where the helicopter was supposed to be waiting was just ahead. But when they reached the clearing, there was no helicopter. Just an empty stretch of land, shrouded in darkness. Ethan's heart sank. "Where's the extraction team?" he demanded, scanning the area. Crow cursed under his breath. "They must have been delayed. We'll have to hold out until they arrive." But Ethan knew they didn't have much time. The facility's guards would be on them any moment, and they were low on ammunition with nowhere to run. He turned to Crow, his mind racing. "We need a plan. Now." Before Crow could respond, the ground beneath them began to shake, the rumble of approaching vehicles growing louder. The facility had sent reinforcements and they were closing in fast. Ethan tightened his grip on his weapon, his eyes locked on the treeline. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and with no sign of extraction, their chances of survival were slim. But Ethan Cole wasn't ready to give up. "Not yet." "Get ready," he said to Crow, his voice steady. "We'll make our stand here." Crow nodded, his expression hardening. "Let's make it count." As the first of the facility's guards emerged from the trees, Ethan took a deep breath, his mind focused, his heart pounding with the rhythm of war. The battle wasn't over. The shadows of war had come for them, and Ethan was prepared to fight until the bitter end.